Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. Today, I'm here with this beast of a printer. This is the Peopoly Phenom. So there's not much to show you as far as unboxing or setting up the Phenom goes. Pull off some plastic wrap and some protective film off the front glass there, or front acrylic rather, and you're basically ready to print. You're probably best off to still level the bed, but other than that, there's not much to it. The Phenom comes with the ability to print from USB stick in the side as well as Ethernet, though I didn't test the Ethernet, so I can't comment on that. On either side, there's a large cooling fan to cool the LED array. Behind this big door here, we have the VAT, and under that, obviously, the LCD. The LCD is gigantic. So this is a 276 millimeter wide by 155 millimeter deep screen. To put that in perspective, something like the Anycubic Photon is 155 millimeters in height. We have that just in the depth dimension. And then this massive Z-rail assembly is supporting the nearly 16 inches, 400 millimeters of height that we have. I never realized how much I needed a large resin printer until I got to play with this for the last month. Having that kind of build volume opens up all kinds of possibilities that you would either have to carve into smaller prints or just do on FDM and lower your layer height as much as you're comfortable with to try to increase your quality there. The vat itself, being so large, holds about 1.8 kilograms, 2 liters or so of resin. And some of these prints here, I actually had it filled right to the brim as well. The Z is constrained by two linear rails, one on either side, and a gigantic ball screw down the middle. And at no point during any of my testing did I have any kind of Z banding or artifacting, not that I would expect it with such an over-engineered Z rail assembly. The frame construction is pretty rugged. It is about 110 pounds or so, and it's kind of hard to gauge the size on video, but this is about a third the size of an average home oven. So it's pretty substantial, and it's really a two-person lift if you're moving this around the house or around your workshop. The power to the unit is provided by a kind of laptop style external power supply with just a little barrel plug that plugs in the back here, and you have your standard on and off switch on the side. And for our testing on this printer, we used Peopoly's Deft resin, which is a resin that they say is specifically designed for large format MSLA printers like this one. I believe its formulation is supposed to help with the peeling forces, as is the type of film that they use at the bottom. I believe it's still FEP film, but that's one of the things that they mentioned in their marketing materials. And I did find that to be true. I actually hear and see the effects of the peeling forces on my smaller printers more than I did on this printer with this resin combination. We had about 4 liters or so of resin to do some testing with. All of it came in their Deft Gray, which is this kind of primer gray color you see beside me, and it worked flawlessly. We did all of these at 50 micron layers, which is their recommended layer height, and the recommended slicer is Chitubox. So an open source slicer that I was already using for some of my other printers. It works fantastic. They give you a starting profile and a resin profile so that you can literally just use the defaults and go. The only thing that is up to you really at that point is just your support structure and object orientation. So before we talk about the prints themselves or that experience any further, let's go over the menu system and the on-screen display. So the screen is pretty basic and it does everything you need it to do. Go to Tool, and this is where you can move around the bed, the build plate. So you can move it in 10, 1.1 millimeter increments with the Z. So if I move this up, we will see and hear the build plate move up out of the vat. And at any point in time, if you're moving it, say, down and it's going to crash into the screen or something, you can hit stop. It'll immediately stop. So setting Z equals 0, this is for leveling the build plate. To level the build plate, there are 4 screws, 2 on either side. You want to loosen those so that the build plate is kind of floating there. Make sure that it is secure up top here with the knob. And then pull the vat out. Unscrew each of these little retention knobs. I'll slide the entire vat Oops. Oh. And then take a regular piece of printer paper, put that on here, and then we're going to lower the bed. Well, we'll home it first, which will get us close. So homing gets us very close, but there is zero drag on this piece of paper. What we want to do is lower it, again, with these screws completely loose. Lower it until it is flat against the paper. Press down with your hand, or gloved hand if this is dirty, obviously. Press down with your hand, and then tighten the screws while you're pressing equally on both sides. At that point in time, you should be able to pull the paper out with some resistance, but not be able to push it back in because it's pressed too tightly against the screen. At that point, you've leveled your bed. You want to go back and do set Z equals 0. And then it stores that exact position as being the true 0 for the machine. That's where it's going to build its first layer when you go to print. Under System, we have information about the firmware itself, the version that we're on. We can turn on or off the beeping sound. Under Service, you have the information for contacting support. Language, we're obviously on English. And Network, this is your IP information. It's got a Wi-Fi icon on here and a hardwire icon. Again, as I said, I didn't play with any of the network abilities, so I can't comment on that at this time. So after inserting the USB stick, you hit print, and now you can see previews generated by ChitDoBox on for any of the prints that you've printed. So here is a lithophane that I printed that we'll show in a minute. It's printed vertically. And here is one of the prints that I did. It's the Spacex Falcon 9 grid fin, stabilizing grid fin. If I hit the play button here, it's gonna bring the build plate down and prepare to start printing that file. I have a few seconds as the build plate comes down, so I can kind of show you. Once you've hit play, you can hit the gear, and it actually shows you the number of bottom layers, the exposure, and the per layer exposure times. You can actually modify these by tapping on them and changing the number of base layers, the number of seconds, 50 seconds for the base layer, etc. But I actually don't want this print to start, so I'm going to cancel that. So as you could probably hear there, it's not the quietest machine in the world. It's not meant to be. It's really meant more for like the workshop instead of, say, your bedroom or your home office. The two fans move an obscene amount of air to keep the assembly cool. And I know that in the documentation, they also suggest keeping the resin vat quite full to act almost like a heat sink for the LCD to draw that heat away. After some of these longer prints, these multi-day prints here in some cases, the resin was noticeably warm. Not that that's a problem. And even cold, the resin is extremely viscous. It's a very runny resin, and I think that's partially by design. Other resins that I've used are almost like gummy, especially at colder temperatures. And so having things at the right temperature, maybe 22, 23 degrees ambient, is good. In this case, ambient temperature wasn't an issue at all because it was always running much higher than that. So the first print I did was a pre-sliced file off of the USB stick here, and it was actually 8 of these little geometric shapes. I destroyed 4 of them in various ways. So I found that my normal washing technique using IPA or isopropyl alcohol, I was using 99% like I always do, not rubbing alcohol, they're not interchangeable. And I do a 2-bucket system. A dirty bucket, if you will, to get the bulk resin off, and then a clean bucket of IPA to get any residual resin off the prints. That didn't seem to work all that great. Some of these still had residues of sorts in these little tiny pockets in here. This is not solid, though it may look like it at first glance. It's actually almost like a fractal design in there. And there are tiny, tiny, tiny little pores. So when I cured them, you'd see these white stains from residue IPA resin combination. So throwing them in an ultrasonic bath, not just straight IPA in an ultrasonic, but in a bag or another container with the IPA, and then put that in the water bath in your ultrasonic, worked out much, much better. I kept some of the bad ones just to show a bad example. Others, when I cured them like this, which I normally wouldn't do. I would peel off the supports first, but when I cured them and tried to pull off the supports, I cracked them in various ways. So that's why these ones don't have the supports pulled off yet. And the resin itself is, well, typically brittle, you know, like most resins are. That's a very thin base, but you know, it does shatter as you'd kind of expect from your average resin. And in a similar fashion, when I peeled them off, it would break off the very fragile bar or post portion of it there. So I thought it would be kind of fun to show you what I did a little bit. You can also see that the base is curved, so most resins do shrink when they cure, and based on the geometry, it shrinks in kind of interesting ways. Some of them shrunk to the point where these are actually bowed like this, so maybe the inner section shrunk and pulled this inward. Others, this remained perfectly intact and square, but you know, the base curved as it kind of shrunk and contracted upwards. But that was the initial first print, and what it proved to me was, number one, the machine functions as you would expect. Pre-sliced file, there's no guesswork there. The second thing, and more importantly in my eyes, is that my leveling was bang on. So all of the 8 pieces covered the bed 4 wide, 2 deep, and they all bonded to the bed perfectly. To that point, these rafts have a little beveled edge, which makes it easy to get the plastic scraper underneath there, and they pop off with like a satisfying pop. The bed has this almost like sandblasted texture to it, and it works fantastic for keeping stuff adhered, but like I said, they come off in one fell swoop. You really got to be careful because things can go flying around, but that was never an issue. Getting them off was never an issue, and having them stuck was never an issue. So it's nice to not have to worry about adhesion issues for once. So then I went on to an old faithful familiar print that I think is a lot of fun. I've printed many of these in FDM and supersized ones as well. This is the T-Rex head from MakerBot, I believe. We'll have the link down below, along with the links to all the other files, except the pre-sliced one that it comes with. And I was a little bit hesitant, being that this was a much longer print. I wanted to add some supports just in case. I know I can print this supportless with FDM, no problem. But I was hesitant, and I believe I just accepted Chitdu's default support recommendation and used that. So the supports were all underneath the jaw here, and each support had a little base to give it some better adhesion to the build plate. In Chitdu, you can take the base and kind of drag it away so that they weren't attaching to the bottom of the model itself and then having to break the base of the support structure away. So this is all, you know, kind of got that sandblasted texture from the build plate, and then we do have some pock marking from the heavy supports in Chitdu that we were using. But that turned out beautifully. One thing that initially kind of concerned me was it is a gigantic screen, but from a resolution standpoint, it has a 74 micron resolution in X and Y, and your smaller printers like a Photon have, you know, essentially like the same resolution screen, but in a smaller form factor. So they have like 47 micron of resolution. So, you know, you're about 70% less resolution, but that didn't make any difference at all for my use. If anything, it kind of smooths things out. I would like to play around with anti-aliasing a little bit. I'm not sure if the firmware supports it, but you can kind of see on the sides. You won't see this on the top. You'll see this on the sides where you can see the pixels or the effect of that lower resolution. You'll see minor layering, a very, very minimal version of what you would expect on FDM. If you were printing a surface like this, you'll see the stepped layers. You kind of see that on the sides in the X and Y. Again, you probably won't even be able to pick it up on camera, to be honest, but it's there and very minimal. The top of the jaw prints like that. And again, normally doesn't need support. I didn't want to waste 24 hours or so of printing, so I added some supports, again accepting the defaults. It was definitely overkill. With the amount of adhesion I'm having to that build plate, I have very, very little concern that I wouldn't be able to print this again without any supports at all. And then the resin does have a little bit of flex before it, you know, shatters like we saw before, so I can get the jaw attached back in there. And it has that flex because this is largely hollow. So I've used the hollowing feature of Chit2Box. I selected a 1 millimeter thick wall, so it's hollow on the inside, 1 millimeter shell, and that gives it plenty of sturdiness. Like I'm not worried about this breaking, you know. But some other defects that were my fault were related to mixing of the resin. So right here along the side of the kind of the nose portion, you can see this white seam. We'll get a close-up shot of that. And that white seam is that between prints and or over time with the resin sitting in the vat for maybe a day or so, it's somewhat kind of separated. I found that the resin that sticks to the top of the build plate when it comes up after a print, I would scrape that resin off before pulling the build plate out, and that resin was more milky than the resin that was in the vat. So now you have this kind of milky resin mixing with the flat gray resin, and if you don't properly stir them all together, you'll end up with this kind of swirl effect in your next print. So lesson learned there, mix your resin. It's always a rule, you know, before you put it in, mix your resin, mix your resin. When it's in the vat, mix it as well. Rule of thumb, when you're working on a smaller printer, everybody says don't leave the resin in the vat for days at a time. You know, empty the vat, strain it, put it back in a bottle. When you're dealing with something like this, with a multi-day print, you don't have a choice. The resin's gonna be in there for days at a time. Even in between prints, I left it in there for days at a time with no ill effects other than that minor separation I mentioned. So, put that guy aside. Some other fun ones. This is my knee, quite literally my right knee before my surgery. So I got my MRI scan, it's a DICOM scan, and I converted it to STL and isolated the bone as best as possible. It even contains the little section where your tendon would connect into the bone there. I think that's LCL, MCL, I can't remember which side is which. And there's a section where it connects there. And of course, I've got that wrong. This goes like this. And so in between here, normally you don't have bone on bone, you've got your meniscus, which would be fun to print that in TPU or maybe flex resin to keep it on the resin printer. But it's just a nice example of a medical application. Actually, a physiotherapist friend of mine wanted a replacement model for her office, so that'll be going to her. And this model here is a scapula done to real life-size scale. This model came to us from a client, Jack Yang. He's a member of the McMaster Education Program in Anatomy. He scanned in this from the McMaster Anatomy Lab. It was a specimen from them. And it's got different numbered indicators for the different components of the scapula. This is a shoulder blade, right? And this turned out fantastic. We had previously printed one of these in a very small scale. I think it was about this big on a smaller printer, and I asked him if we could print this and show this on video in real life size. It's another great medical or anatomical application of 3D printing. And it's quite thin. This one is solid. So because some of the structures, especially here, were quite thin anyway and brittle, I just printed this one solid. And again, it's not really that fragile. So that's kind of cool. And then for all you space nerds out there like me, this is a Spacex Falcon 9 grid fin. We saw it on the screen earlier. This is a model that I got off of Thingiverse. We'll have the link in the description below to credit them. It's a artist's rendition of it. You know, we don't have exact scale dimensions, but if you look at any of the pictures online of it, it is a pretty close likeness of the real thing. And it's kind of hard to gauge the size. This is the full Y build volume of the printer, and it is the full Y and the nearly full Z build volume. I maxed out the Y, keeping the scale all correct so the Z isn't quite at the max, and it was printed, of course, like this on the build plate. And so this has that kind of sandblasted texture I've spoken about. And the only real defect that I've found in this entire print is on the sides, and I think it has to do a little bit with shrinkage and maybe with a little bit of overexposure. At this point, I was still using the default exposure values from those cube test prints, which I found eventually that the layer by layer exposure was on the high side. So where these kind of angular cross members join to the sides here, there's a little ridge that sticks out where each of those kind of join up. Other than that though, honestly, this is flawless. I think this was 2 and a bit days, maybe 49 hours going from memory. And on the front surface, you can see much more of that effect that I was mentioning on the skull. The lower X and Y resolution kind of creating a stepped effect, because this is actually curved out like this. So you can see minor stepping ridges, which is as a result of that resolution. Again, if I had any kind of anti-aliasing, that would be able to smooth that out considerably, and it may have it. I didn't know, I didn't play with it. I also didn't put support here, and really a complete 90-degree overhang, rule of thumb in resin, just don't do it. This is quite small, and I figured, why not? I'll chance it. If it fails, I'll know pretty early on. There's a tiny bit of droop there, but for all intents and purposes, I'm okay with that. I could have definitely added supports on the bed here up to there, and it wouldn't have added any extra like marring to the bottom here, but I didn't. This is 1.1 kilograms. I don't even want to know how much this cost in resin. It's 100% solid. I could beat someone with this thing. But again, this is gonna be manhandled in the shop here, so I wanted it to be able to stand up to the abuse and even the potential drop on the floor, though that one scares me a little bit, just also because of the heft of it. It's gonna hit the floor with some force, but that's pretty cool. And then the last one, a little more personal, is a lithophane. So an FDM, we print lithophanes typically upright like this. Many people print them curved. Printing flat ones, a little bit trickier. You don't really want to be adding supports, but you also don't want it to fall over. So curved is kind of nice bridge between kind of the effectiveness of it, but also it not being a cause for concern falling over mid-print. Because you are, printing it like this with the bed moving back and forth, or maybe not if you're Core XY. And you print it like this because your X and Y resolution are typically way more accurate than your Z. So you wouldn't want to, in FDM, print it like that with that whole stepped effect, because we are dealing with varying thicknesses here, right? So it kind of looks crazy without a light source, and then throw a light source on behind it, and you can actually see it's my daughter sitting on the ground with our cat. So it is, black and white. I did use gray resin, which is definitely not what I would use. It just happens to be what was in the machine. I wasn't going to dump 2 liters of gray resin and strain it and get it back in bottles just to do a tiny 12 or 15 milliliter, whatever this was, print. So doing this in white, it would turn out even better, but I am quite happy with how this turned out. The nice thing is, in resin, unlike FDM, we can do multiples in the same amount of time, because the time it takes to print is only related to how high it is. So if this is 110 millimeters high, we could do 3, 4, 5, 15 of them at the same time, different pictures even, and it would take the same, 4 hours or whatever it took to print this. So if you're doing multiples of items, or even different items, assuming they can just deal with the same exposure settings and whatnot, you can do these items in the same amount of time as well. When I'm getting used to a machine, I like to do a few items at a time. I wouldn't want to fill the build plate my second print and hit go and have a disaster, or if one of them falls off, the whole thing can be a mess. So I printed most of these individually, the knee parts together, 2 prints for the skull, a separate print for this. I even tested lithophanes flat on this. As I mentioned, it's basically a non-starter in FDM. And it turned out quite well. If you're starting with the right picture, with a good contrast between light and dark, not overly dark, it's going to be hard to kind of shine a light through that. It turned out great. And because it's very low Z height, you can print this in about 22 minutes if it's completely flat, not curved, obviously. And then getting it off the build plate requires a little bit of finesse, but it pops off with no issue. And I didn't have any warping or bending as a result of prying it off, or as a result of the post-curing. I hope you found that as interesting and fun as I did, and I hope it opened your eyes to the opportunities that something crazy huge like this opens as far as resin prints and the insane detail that we can achieve on larger items that used to be, for most of us, only obtainable in FDM methods of printing. A big printer does give us these opportunities, but it also presents a whole bunch of challenges. So I thought I had a pretty good workflow worked out with my smaller resin printers, with my 2-bucket system, and my overbuilt, quite large microwave curing device. That's a topic for another video. But I built everything bigger and more powerful than I felt that I would need, because that's just how I roll. But in this case, you need, if you're printing something like this, you now need a bucket or bin of cleaning solution, whether it's IPA or something else, to dunk this in, and then another one that big to fit this in. Otherwise, you're going to be kind of like splashing it on top and trying to effectively rinse it. Likewise, I might have an ultrasonic for my things like this that I'm used to printing, but I can't even fit half of this in my ultrasonic at a time, and that's if I was putting it right in the ultrasonic instead of in some other vessel than in the ultrasonic. So there are, I'd say, some things to consider and some planning to be done around using a printer this large. I was admittedly a little excited, and I pulled, say, this off the printer, one of the first big prints that I did, and I ran over to my bucket and I'm like, this doesn't fit in the bucket at once. So then I upgraded before I went to something like this. But I could fit this in my curing chamber, but I couldn't fit this. So I had to improvise. And that proved to have its own set of challenges as well. I personally can't wait to take this home. I will be buying one of these myself and putting it through its paces even further. I'm going to play with different resins. I'm going to print some drone parts in flex resin, which I know a lot of those guys are printing TPU, so I'm going to take some flex and try to replicate some of those components. And I'm also going to play with some different layer heights, because as I mentioned, all of this is 50 micron layers. And that takes a long time, and especially if I need a high quality prototype or even finished product, especially if it's being primed or painted or something, maybe 50 micron isn't required. 100 might be more than enough, or somewhere in between there. And likewise, I might want to go even lower. I might want to go to 30 micron. I'm sure not going to print this in 30 micron. I'm not that patient, to be honest. So hopefully you found that useful. Remember to like and subscribe and ring the bell to get notified when we upload more videos like the Phenom. And if you have any specific questions about the Phenom, leave me a comment down below, or if you have any questions about any of the other videos we've uploaded to the channel. Thanks for watching.